Welcome to the live event where we talk about crushing anxiety. Now, the 7 step reset, which is what it's focused on, is actually designed for transformation. I use this in my 90-day transformation program to help people transform in each of the 7 performance areas, not to make a weakness into a strength, but to make sure the weaknesses or at least above a baseline so that they're not hurting them. And those 7 performance areas are mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, relationship, professional, and financial. Now, the 7 step reset works with each of those areas as we run laps around, especially the first four: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. When you get to the other side, after emotional, and I call emotional the gateway to where we have to work with other people. So the mental, physical, spiritual is 100% in our control. The relationship, professional, and financial has to rely or relies on other people to be involved. And so emotional is the gateway because people can so easily be hijacked, especially now with all of the changes going on, especially in the United States, but all over the world. There's so much change going on and uncertainty. You know, we talk about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and that leads to the BANI, brittle, anxiousness, non-linear, and incomprehensible. And so one is the external and the other is the experience. And the 7 step reset gives us a new way of living so that BANI doesn't have to be a foregone conclusion. As a matter of fact, you'll see that once we go through it, you don't really experience that anymore. That's the end state objective, and we're talking 6 months. We're not talking 6 years. So this is something that can be done in 2 to 3 months on the early side, and I would say in 6 months you'll have it. Now, the today's topic, neuroplasticity, is probably by far the biggest potential obstacle, but also the biggest catalyst for breakthrough. Once you get it, it changes everything. But the resistance to getting it makes it difficult. Where I was going to go with the relationship, professional, and the financial, I'm actually reading the book now, Primal Leadership. And he talks about, and the reason is because I'm bridging the gap between what I have, 7 performance areas, and emotional intelligence, because the topics seem to be talking about similar things, but there is a distinction. And I would say the emotional intelligence is a very, very rich topic, by the way. And as a leader, for my dynamic leadership, what I would say is that the emotional intelligence that we have for ourselves applies to social intelligence, which is what the book Primal Leadership is about, or in general. When you can see your own world through the lens of the neural pathways, quote, aka neuroplasticity, you'll spot it in others as well. And that's the essence of this of dynamic leadership, being able to read what's going on with other people and adjusting real time your approach. For example, if I told you that a person you're about to have a one-on-one with is about to have a nervous breakdown, they are anxious, they're on the edge, and their heart rate variability is way below their baseline. Their beta brain, the amount of time they're spending in beta brainwave state is off the charts. It's so high. I would guess that most of you would probably postpone your one-on-one, even if it was not a high impact one-on-one. This is what neuroplasticity does for us. It gives us the ability to see what's going on, what has been taught as the mind. And you can't see what's going on in a person's mind, but because neuroplasticity is the network of neurons and we can see it. This is why you've seen the content that says 55% of our communication is physiology, and then 37% is tone and your nonverbals, I should say, and then 7% is words. And in sales, I have argued that, and I agree with that in certain circumstances, but I've also argued against it because from a sales standpoint, when I'm listening to a prospect, I am and because of the kinds of questions I'm asking, those words I'm taking as near 100%. Why? Because I'm into their conscious mind. I'm not into their reaction. So there's the distinction. When you're in a person's reaction, you're dealing with the network of neurons, the neuroplasticity. When you're in their conscious mind and you can actually get those words and you're seeing them pause before they speak, those are the words I rely on. Same with coaching. If I'm coaching a person, I want that conscious mind response. I don't want the reaction response. The reaction response is back to the 55% of communication is physiology. I don't want that. I want the near 100%, which is their words in a conscious mind. And if you can ask the question why 3, 4, 5, up to 7 times, and get a deeper answer each time. When you get that deep answer, that's the answer you can take to the bank. Because if I come to them 5 years from now, chances are that deep answer will be the same. And that's why it's so powerful. Anyway, that's just a way of looking at this topic. And if you're a coach, counselor, mentor in this field, I'd love to have you come on either today or anytime. Because these stay up. So if you watch this some other time, just send me an email. You can use 7fitnessseries@gmail.com. And that's also on the website, which is in the chat, 7stepreset.com/live. And you can come online. It looks like it's holding up with that same URL, studiorestream.io, EDC, etc. It's in the chat. That will bring you online anytime I'm live. I think I've asked them to create that so it's static, and it looks like they've done that now. So join me online, and I will have this neuroplasticity topic at your convenience. Well, I go live every day, every weekday at 8 a.m. If you want to talk about neuroplasticity in the context of the mind, psychology, any of that, I'd love to have that conversation, because when you look at psychology, it's defined as understanding the subconscious mind. I argue that it's not a mind at all, it's a network of neurons. And neuroscientists I've spoken to agree with that, but the ability to change the wording from subconscious mind to network of neurons, imagine the amount of textbooks that would have to change. Imagine the amount of courses and curriculum that would have to change. The father of psychology, William James, you'd have to go back and how do you undo all of that? The Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the 6 human needs, all of that has been predicated upon calling it a subconscious mind. And I would say that the philosophers in the New Thought era from about 1850, which is from about 1850 to around 1942, they had it right. It's just that they didn't have the brain scanning tools we do today to show that it's not a mind, it's actually the network of neurons. Last week I talked about how I used the metaphor of driving the car, not understanding how the car is built and designed. I noticed that what's replacing a lot of the subconscious conversation is now talking about the brain, what's going on in the basal ganglia, and what's going on in the hippocampus, and what's happening in the prefrontal cortex. And I work hard not to bring brain terms or neuroscientific terms into the conversation because I want to keep it accessible. I would argue that while all of that around the brain and the parts of the brain and when they engage is accurate, it's all neurons, and neurons behave the same way. So we don't need to confuse it with talking about the parts of the brain if you understand how neurons behave and how you can change neurons, because you can change the neurons wherever they are. So that's why I go back to that. That's why this neuroplasticity is an important topic. I'll probably stay on this for a couple of days because it is so important. I was going to talk about priming, and let me bring this up. I talked about beliefs yesterday. I'll talk about neuroplasticity today. This is all step 1 in the 7-step reset. Talk about priming, and then mindset. But I'll see where I go today with neuroplasticity, and I just may stay. I may stay there. Let me first bring up this slide for the 7-step reset. So the 7-step reset, as I said, I created it as the framework to help people do laps around the 7 performance areas. It's helpful to have labels for things, and it's also helpful to have a roadmap. So when I use the 7-step reset, as also when I use the 7 performance areas, I use them as roadmaps so I instantly can see where a person is. Once I can see where they are, it makes it easier to decide what to do next. So if a person gets stuck in the 7 performance areas, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, I'm always paying attention to how are they doing in the mental part, the physical part. And the physical part is very broad because most of what we do is dealing with neurons, and neurons are physiological and neurobiological, but a large part of that is physiology. And then I look at them from a spiritual standpoint, where they are spiritually, not spiritual as in the spiritual sense, but in the higher self. Right? I would say our higher self interacts with the real spiritual realm. So I don't deal with the spiritual realm. I stop it here at the higher self, and then that way people can do what they do from the spiritual self. But if you are living by faith, if you are living into whatever spirituality, I would say having agency precedes that. If you don't have agency and you can be hijacked at any time, then it's difficult to rely on living by faith because you'll fall off of that. I'll leave it there. But the point is, I'm looking at where they are. So look at spiritual as awareness of awareness, right? Self-awareness and then awareness of awareness. And that's like consciousness. So I'm looking at that, and then I look at the emotional part. If they're being triggered very easily, if they're reacting to some words and they're not able to let it go, and then they go down that little rabbit hole. And I'm not talking about big stuff. I'm talking about within seconds. If they have to go down this thing in seconds, they're more easily emotionally charged at that point in time. And there may be some topics I won't touch on. I'll wait until we can get either to a calmer state, or we call that out and let them work through that, because I want to be interacting with the conscious mind, which is exhausting. It's exhausting because the subconscious network of neurons processes information at 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second. So you can imagine the difference between those two. The subconscious is firing stuff off, and the conscious mind is just trying to keep up. It's interesting. Oh, yeah. Okay, so didn't realize I didn't have this up. Let's see if that comes up. Okay, so the 7-step reset, and this is sort of a blend. I actually updated it today. I'll start showing the updated one tomorrow, but this is sort of a blend of where things are, and then I've updated it to be more about future, where things are after you learn the 7 steps. So this is a transition slide, but I want to show this in terms of what it's done. So the pre-stimulus, beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology, this is where we live. This is who we are on a regular basis. This might be the same all day long here, but if you get triggered, if something happens to you on the way to work in your commute, and you just, you get off kilter a little bit, this could influence your day. It's very often talked about how it can take hours to let those chemicals that come up in a neurobiological event called emotional charge, it could take hours for that to subside. So we need to be able to, one, note where we are, which is step 2, and also adjust. So not only do we learn how to improve these over time and get better and better and better, we're also learning how to get back to a homeostasis point of view. So for example, let's say something I get some really bad news at 10 o'clock in the morning and I have some important meetings to go through, that really bad news needs to be dealt with, but I don't have to deal with it right now, and I don't have to let it ruin my day. I can put it aside and come back to it later. These are the skills that we use between 1 and 2. So not only do we set a baseline here that's positive and an empowerment catalyst, not a resistance factor, but then we also set ourselves up so we can get back there quickly. So this step 2 becomes like a dashboard where we're constantly monitoring how am I doing from a mental state of being, a physical state, emotional state, spiritual state. How am I doing there? What's my self-image like? In self-image, you can tell where your self-image is by your self-talk. If your self-talk is degrading and you're focusing on mistakes and you're thinking about bad luck that happened and why did you're not in a very positive state, and it might be difficult to change that, but you can put it aside and you can step into, you can anchor some states. But I would say if it's really that bad, we need to get back to that, and maybe you just take some time and there's different ways. I don't say you have to meditate to be able to do this, but meditation is one way. There's other things, and we'll talk about that when we get into priming. So today, again, I'm talking about neuroplasticity, but in priming, we can prime ourselves into a new state, and we sort of unprime ourselves, right? If you get that bad news, now you're being primed into this place over here. Or if your self-talk is degrading and negative, you're being primed into this lower, more resistance kind of state rather than empowerment catalyst. But there's ways to reverse that priming. There's ways to do this in the short term to get through the day so you can still be productive. But we also want to have tools so that our steady state is there, but also we maintain that steady state, and it's harder and harder and harder to fall off. So I'll tell you that I don't experience emotional charge in this process because I've worked it out. I set this whole thing up, these first 4 steps, so this doesn't happen. Not even once a month do I have to do something to deal with an emotional charge, because the emotional charge is all about where you are in these first 4 steps. And obviously a big part of is step 3, which we'll get to later. And you can always go to the 7stepreset.com/live. And on that page, I have recordings of some of these steps. Eventually I have all 7 recordings out there, but you can also look at previous talks that I've done for more content about that. So and then we get to step 3, which is the conditioned reaction. This is where most people live, and then they let their reaction become the response. That's a major step we have to do right off the bat, is make sure that there's separation between your reaction and your response, because if your response equals your reaction, you're just creating more yesterdays for your tomorrows. And that's where triggering comes in. You can actually see it real time when a person is triggered, like the videos, or a person is triggered, and you can see that they're not even thinking. It's not rational, and rational information doesn't take root because they're just being triggered. It's all an internal experience. And if you're ever around a person who's in that state of being triggered and they can't do anything, and then you throw in a different stimulus, maybe a dog starts barking at them, or something happens that re-triggers or changes the trigger, it's like they completely let that go and go over to this other thing. But when you try to talk to them rationally, it doesn't work. I remember one guru would talk about, when they would get there, he would just throw water on them or something crazy like that to just completely break their state. But I don't want to rely on external things to come in and change our state. That's why we do the 7-step reset. And then if you need to do an emotional modulation step, then we do that. That's step 5, and then you can take action. So we don't want to have our conditioned reaction equal our response, and we don't want it to equal our action, unless it should. Obviously, if we're being attacked by a tiger on the Serengeti, we don't want to have a gap here. We want this action to be right away. But for most of us dealing with business and such and emails, I mean, the email has already been sitting in your inbox for maybe an hour or more. Reading it now, yes, you may feel like you have to do something about it right now, but it could already be a day old. So we don't have to act on it right now. And this is why you want to have these these two steps in between your reaction, or between the stimulus and the reaction, and then the action. And then step seven brings us back to mindfulness, because as I say up here, you can't stop the 33,000 daily stimuli, but you can have them working for you. I call that the automaticity. And since that next stimulus is coming potentially in a second or two, right? 33,000 daily stimulus response cycles, and you're awake about 65,000 seconds. That next one is coming pretty quickly. And that's why we have to return back to mindfulness, and that's managing this 712. This is the loop, 712. This is what we control. We don't control what comes to us, but by controlling the 712, we get command over the 456. So let's take a look now at the neuroplasticity. Again, the B is for beliefs, P is for priming, M is for mindset. And then in the middle, we have P, physiology. So neuroplasticity is the network of neurons. And in that topic, there's three. I say I don't like to bring in neuroscience terms. It's hard to get away from it when I'm talking about neuroplasticity. But we have neurons. We have the synapse. And a subset of that synapse would be the neurotransmitters. So the synapse is the neurotransmitter. It's what allows one neuron to connect to another neuron. And then we have myelin. And I would add the term that applies to all of this, but I'll keep it a separate term, synaptogenesis. And you can Google any of these terms and get a working definition of them so that you understand it. But this is where we spend our time in the 7-step reset. I'm always going back to the neural pathways. So we'll call at a high level, it's neural pathway change. So we like to say in neuroplasticity that the brain we're born with does not have to be the brain that we die with. Neural pathways make up most of the brain. I already mentioned about the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, etc. It's all neural pathways. And neurons behave the same way at this level, as well as the neurotransmitter behaves the same way. So understanding the different parts of the brain is not necessary. The same way understanding the difference between a throttle body and what the turbocharger does, and what the difference is with 2 valves per cylinder or 4 valves per cylinder, that doesn't matter in terms of getting in the car and driving the car. You can even drive a car at a high performance level without understanding those things. Now, if you are the mechanic, obviously you have to understand that. But for us, managing our day and getting through our day, and specifically the topic around these live events, which is crushing anxiety, stopping the spiral before it starts, we don't have to pay attention to all of the individual things, but I do bring them up so that we understand it. Now, I've said many times that to know and not do is not much better than not knowing. To know and not do is not much better than not knowing. I actually say to know and not do is to not know. It's not actually accurate, obviously, but I think it paints the picture. And it does say that, hey, we need to be focusing on doing. To start painting this picture around neuroplasticity. So the subconscious, what people call a subconscious, I don't call it a mind, but the subconscious, I'm saying, is actually the network of neurons. If you made a list of what does the subconscious do, you can Google it. What does the subconscious do? And then you make another list. What does the network of neurons do? Now, depending on your search history and all that, see, I probably see different things in my search history than you do in yours because I look up a lot of this content. But if you look at what the network of neurons does, or you can look at it individually, the neurons, the synapses, the myelin, synaptogenesis, neurotransmitters, how does that all come into play? And then I'd probably add another one on here, deep practice. So deep practice is how we change our neuroplasticity. The habits reside in the network of neurons. So if you want to change your habits, you are literally saying you want to change your network of neurons. So it makes sense to know how to change the network of neurons. Now the neurons, we have 100 billion of them, 20 billion are in the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex was mostly formed from 19 to 27, but the majority of the conditioning happened from age 0 to 7. It happened from age 0 to 7 because children at that age, and especially 0 to 2, they're in the theta state, so they don't have to work for it. Everything just goes in. This is why language is so easy to learn for small children and young children. And then from 3 to 7, they're more in the alpha state. But again, it's like a semi-hypnotic state. They're just learning like a sponge. If you have children and you watch the children stand like you, they use your mannerisms, they speak like you, they just picked it up. Stuff that you never wanted them to learn, they picked up because that's their job from 0 to 7. And then from their teens, the personality forms, and then I like to say from 19 to 27, the prefrontal cortex completes its forming with its 20 billion neurons, and in that formation, it's locking in the person's model of the world, and this is why by age 35, we feel like nothing works and all we can do is live by habit, but it's not true. What is true is that in our 20s, when we're still getting more development of our 20 billion neurons, there's an abundance of neurotransmitter, and that abundance of neurotransmitter makes it easy to set habits. This is why willpower, in my opinion, is more easily accessed in our 20s than it is in our 30s. By the time we're in our 30s, willpower wanes throughout the day. It does too in the 20s, but you don't notice it as much. Willpower wanes with decision making. Willpower is actually reverse correlated with correlated with HRV. So as HRV goes up, your willpower goes up. And the more you can do by habit, the less you have to rely on willpower. That's a big takeaway. If 95% of everything we do is done by habit, I don't want to change that. I'm not trying to get to 60% by habit. But what I would like to get to is to have my habits working for me. The automaticity, I want the automaticity working for me. And so creating habits that are aligned with my life design and my vision, it just makes sense. So what do these things do? We have 100 billion neurons. Each neuron is connected to anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. I've seen numbers as high as 100,000 other neurons. But when something is that small, think about it. There's 100 billion of them inside of our brain. It's like, how do you even see that with the most powerful microscope? I obviously they do, but to argue whether or not it's connected to 1,000 versus 10,000 versus 100,000, we're talking about trillions of connections regardless, and trillions of connections make it a non-issue for this topic, at least at this level. So the neuron, I'm not going to draw these the way you see them in science books, but you can go look online for an image of a neuron. But the neurons make up one part of a neural pathway. Now, the reason I talked about each neuron being connected with 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons is that if you think about making a step, if I make a step from here to there, I'm probably engaging thousands and thousands of neural pathways just to make that step. To say what I'm saying right now, I'm engaging thousands of neural pathways. Remember, there's trillions of them. So it's nothing to be engaging thousands of them. But the neurons are not a neural pathway. They make up the neural pathway, but they don't make a pathway by themselves. In between the synapse do not equal a pathway. Together, you have a pathway. So when you start talking about changing a habit, we are talking about changing the pathway, but not just the pathway. There's thousands, and they are associated together. They say neurons that fire together wire together. So you have thousands of them, and they make up associations. This is why it's so hard to break a habit, because you have these associations, and then you have what I call the latent or dormant association. So you can change the habit at the surface level, but then you get triggered, and now you have associations coming in that are at a lower level, and they get you right back in. This is where the person falls off the wagon. You know, they were making progress, and then they're, back where they were before. And this goes over and on and on and on. So I don't advocate breaking a habit. What I do advocate is replacing the habit. And here's why. And this is the important point. If you take anything away, I hope you take this away. That the synapse is finite. And there's not enough neurotransmitter. It's also a neurotransmitter. There's not enough neurotransmitter to go around for all the neural pathways. So there's another part of this. When a neuron now, we also have something else going on. The neurons are wrapped with myelin. So this is a strong pathway. High neurotransmitter and high myelin. Strong neural pathways are associated with habitual patterns. The stronger the habitual pattern, I'm not talking about this from a neuroscience point of view. So the neuroscientists, when you get into that subject, it's in its infancy. If you consider that hunter-gatherers are around 10,000 years ago, and you can see data that says the brain is over 100,000 years old. The most common one I see is probably 200 to 300,000 years old. And we've had the brain scanning tools available to us to look at things like the neurons for just a few decades. And so neuroscience is in its infancy, and the scientists are still in that, and they will be for a while, that peer-reviewed era. They've got to get peer-reviewed, and so the research tends to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, learning more and more and more about a throttle body, while another group is learning more and more and more and more about a turbocharger, while somebody else is just going to the store and buying a throttle body and a turbocharger that are said to work together and taking off and winning races. We don't need the depth. What we need to do is understand how it all relates together, which is why I do these topics. So high myelin. Myelin happens, like you've heard me, I've already said that from 0 to 7, the bar for myelin is very, very low. And the bar for flooding the neural pathways or the potential neural pathways with synapses is very low. And there's a high abundance of neurotransmitter. So if you look at the neurotransmitter availability from 0 to 7 and the neurotransmitter available for a 50-year-old, it's way different. The 50-year-old, two things have been happening. One is all this stuff wanes with age. But neurotransmitter is very responsive to load, putting on a load. Conversely, the brain, the way the brain and central nervous system is set up, is that homeostasis, getting back to status quo, so to speak, stabilized, efficient, that's what's programmed in. And it makes sense because as a hunter-gatherer, you've got to hunt-gather. You want to learn these things and then do them because what you learn from age 0 to 7 is probably the same as what you use at age 35. And so why recreate the wheel? You learn it and then you apply it. So, but today we're constantly having to learn new things. This is why learning can be so exhausting. We're constantly having to learn new things and we have habits that are fighting us. And so learning, I say, you go back to the neurons, and part of this is being able to see the distinction between when am I operating out of my conscious mind versus when am I operating out of my subconscious, or in the case I talk about it as the network of neurons. So at 50, because we don't put a load on ourselves, the neurotransmitter is reduced. That means there's less of this neurotransmitter to go around to fill up all of the neural pathways, and the less used neural pathways don't get much neurotransmitter in them. The other thing that happens is when neurons get wrapped with myelin, they fire faster, with more strength, and with more accuracy. And what do I mean by accuracy? Think about muscle memory. If a person is shooting free throws, they jump, they've got to push the ball, release the ball. All of those have to be coordinated. If you mistime them, you'll miss the shot. When you see a Steph Curry hitting free throw after free throw from these far distances, he did that using he got there by using deep practice, which creates myelinated neurons, and those neurons fire with precision. Now, I've read that a neuron fires, as long as it's firing between plus and minus 4 milliseconds. So you have an 8 thousandths of a second range that the neuron can fire, and as long as it's within that range, it's going to execute the step. But now you consider you have thousands and thousands of neurons connected together with synapses, and they're firing. Some are plus 2 milliseconds, some are minus 3 milliseconds, some are plus 4 milliseconds, some are right at 0. So your result at the end is this sloppy thing. If you ever watch kids on skateboards practicing the ollie or the flip, what you'll see is how they're using deep practice. They're over and over and over and over. And they don't really care that they miss. They just over and then they get one, but they don't expect the next one. They may expect it, but they know that the next one is probably not going to be perfect. But then they have to get 5 or 6 or 7 in a row. And when they can do 5 or 6 or 7 in a row, then they go show their friends. That's deep practice at work. I've read that Steph Curry, he doesn't just shoot at the basket when he's practicing at the rim. He's aiming relative to where the hooks are for the net. That's that deep practice, focusing, and that tells the central nervous system that this is important. The reason I went there is because when I talk about it from a muscle memory standpoint, I won't get much disagreement. People agree, yeah, that makes sense. They've experienced it. People have played sports. They've experienced muscle memory. They also know that when they get back, they feel kind of rusty. But if you pay attention, let's say you ski or you hike or you have a seasonal sport, you'll probably notice that the first day or two you feel clumsy. Like if you're hiking and you're scrambling, you may feel unsteady on some terrain, but within a day or two, it's like you're back. What happened? With skiing, the first day out, it's like I feel so sloppy. The timing is off. You even struggle sometimes just to get yourself set up. Whereas at the end of the season, you're off the lift and gone. That process is called synaptogenesis. The neurotransmitter leaves the dormant neural pathways and goes to the neural pathways that the system is deeming important. This is why there's so much muscle memory with deep practice. Now, what's interesting is when the synapses goes away, the myelin doesn't necessarily go away. The myelin stays. This is why you can come back at the beginning of the next season and it comes online very quickly because the system puts neurotransmitter back into that neural pathway. And now it equals a pathway again. When you get this concept at the muscle memory level, which should come pretty quickly because we all think about muscle memory, and I'll tell you it's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. Most people can get here pretty quickly. Once you can get here, the big leap that you have to make, but it shouldn't be a big leap in actual practice, is to recognize that the same neuron behavior is at play with my actions and my thoughts and my speaking. In other words, cognitive processing is physiological. It's neurons and neural pathways. It's not the conscious mind. There's a reason the conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second and only 5% of our lives is being governed by that, whereas 95% of our lives are being governed by the habitual patterns and network of neurons. That processes at 11 million bits per second. And you can see what's going on here. It's energy that's flowing through the neural pathways, and that's why it's so fast. Conscious mind can't keep up. But what we can do is create the automaticity so that what we get is aligned with our life design. And from a life design standpoint, it's not just muscle memory, it's everything that I do. And let me give you some real world examples that you can play with and start to wrap your head around it. Now, I will look at the world through the network of neurons. If I'm interacting with somebody and I need to change and I'm making a shift, whether it's in sales or leadership, and I want to make a shift, I'm looking at it from the network of neurons standpoint. I'm not looking at it as a mind, because I can't see the mind, but the network of neurons, there's plenty of clues. And once you see it through there, in my opinion, you can't unsee it. So let's talk about if you've sold before, and if you've been in leadership training, you've probably encountered this thing called role play. And many people don't like role play, but when you talk to the best of the best, when you talk to the salespeople in the 90th percentile, virtually everyone I've ever spoken to has said that they practice. And they practice out loud. They practice their presentation and they practice their presentation out loud. Now, on the surface, you might think, well, why? Well, to know and not do is to not know. Using this model that I'm talking about, where do you think rehearsing the sales presentation inside my mind quietly, where do you think that resides? Majority. Is that in my conscious mind, or is it that largely in the network of neurons? I would argue that it's in the conscious mind. If I practice out loud, speaking, what am I doing? I'm engaging some of my neurons because I have to speak. I'm engaging some of my neurons. If I role play with somebody and they're throwing me ideas and red herrings that I have to respond to, I'm now building those neural pathways up as well. So I'm working on the neural pathways that cause me to think and respond. And that's back to my 7 steps. So you can see this is happening. It's happening between 3 and 6. Reaction, response, what my response should be, or what it seems like it should be, a check-in for emotions, and then my action. But that can happen inside of a half a second. Can happen inside of a quarter second if you let your reaction equal your response and your action. And that's not what we want to do. We want to have that pause. And it's only a quarter second or a half second pause. It's not even noticeable. A quarter to a half second pause is not even noticeable, but that's enough time for the network of neurons to hand off to the conscious mind useful information to enhance the response and the follow-up action. Now, to make this real, I go live every day. Why do I go live every day? Obviously, there's something, I have a message I want people to get. But check this out. What am I doing every day when I go live? I'm speaking. Now, I'm not just speaking. I'm speaking to a live audience. I'm streaming to 5 different platforms or pages. That means I don't really know who's watching. But I know that I have to work on my flow. I know that I have to be careful about my vernacular. I have to pay attention to my pauses and my spaces with nothing being said. And I want to be accurate. I don't want to have to go in and edit and take things out. I want to be accurate, which means I have to be thinking about it. This is like the salesperson role-playing on steroids. I am role-playing, speaking about my topic, and I'm doing it in a way that makes my central nervous system say, oh, this is important. So what happens when the central nervous system says, oh, this is important? When the central nervous system says that, it sends more, it creates more, makes the brain create more neurotransmitter. The brain is not out there just creating neurotransmitters, so that it's an energy hog. The brain uses 20% of our resting metabolism. It's not a lot of excess energy for neurotransmitter because it has to take it from somewhere else. And then when you get brain fog, you get tired, you're dehydrated, you're not breathing well, the brain has even less nutrients to function. So it gets stingy on the neurotransmitter, so it's either going here or it's going here. It's not going everywhere. And that process is called allostasis. Similar family to homeostasis. Homeostasis is wanting to get stable at a status quo view. Allostasis wants to get stable at an increasing view. So when I draw that image of breaking above the line, we're talking about allostasis and keeping that trajectory going up. I will go so far in doing these live events. I don't do it now, but I did in the beginning to get myself into that right place. I would go into ChatGPT. I would upload a similar transcript for what I planned on talking about that day, and I would have ChatGPT act like my audience. I would label, act like this audience, and come up with questions that they might have based on this transcript. And then I wouldn't look at the questions until I was ready to do my Q&A. And then I would do a Q&A, and I would say something like, while I'm waiting for people to come on with questions, I'll start with some that I've gotten in the past. And I'll read the questions for the first time on screen in that moment and then answer it. That evolved to, if I have 10 questions, that evolved to me scanning and looking at which questions I wanted to answer. So this is what I would do in a live event. So hopefully you can see what I just said is logical, right? You said it makes sense. And then a person might say, oh, I know how to do that. And then they move on. Knowing and doing are 2 different things. By doing it real time, in front of the camera, to live audiences, and at that time I was streaming to 8 different platforms at the same time. And I couldn't see at all if anybody was on the other side, because the way it was, you just couldn't see. It only shows who's on, my streaming software at the time only showed who was actually on that streaming platform, but it didn't show who was downstream in the stream. I'm telling you that to impress upon you how I think as I look at everything through the network of neurons. Does it make a difference? 100%. Now, you know how muscle memory works. If I told you that when I was taking and when I take these topics and I talk about them in a live setting like this, if I tell you that my flow improves when I'm talking to people in real life, it probably wouldn't surprise you. What would surprise you is how much it improves. And here's the thing that I think people sleep on. Remember the trillions of neuron connections? Remember the neurons that fire together, wire together? When I'm doing this flow in real life, the associations are just growing and expanding and expanding and expanding. This is why I'll use another example that people can relate to real time. If you're ever talking about a topic, there's three experiences you may see. One is the people's eyes glass over. Two is they nod their head, they're agreeing, and they get it. And three, these are at a macro level. Three, telling tension comes up. They want to say something. They want to speak. That telling tension is the person's associations kicking in because you've said something that set off some associations, and now they want to chime in and they want to talk. If you're a leader or you're a salesperson, I 100% recommend you pause and have them voice what's coming up for them. Because you want to, if you keep talking and they're getting that telling tension, they're not going to hear it anyway. The person whose eyes glass over, you've probably overloaded their system, and that's why I don't like to talk about the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, etc. You overload the system, and it's trying to map these things back together. And that's also why I introduce it, because I believe that one of the reasons people's eyes glass over is because they're trying to map what I'm saying to what they heard about the prefrontal cortex or the amygdala, which are common terms that are brought up in this space. And then the person who's nodding their head, yes, they're getting it. You're tapping into associations that they already have and they're aligned. So if I wanted to ask someone what's coming up for you, and I'm in a live audience, I'd ask the person who's showing telling tension. If I want to ask a person to contribute or offer a different perspective on what I'm saying, I would pick on the person who is nodding their head and agreeing because they're already having associations that are aligned. And if I want to get some counterpoints, I would call on the person whose eyes are glassed over. And it's just once you start seeing the world through the network of neurons, and that's the bigger point, you'll start to behave in a way that's aligned with that. And that makes sense because if 95% of everything we do is done by habit, why would I be spending my time on the 5% that's the conscious mind? I'm going to leave it there.